It's hard to imagine how scary life was in the Middle Ages during the Black Death. By the time the disease ran its course, it had killed at least one-third of the people in Europe and probably more. In Paris, France, it's estimated that around 800 people died a day. There were so many dead that they couldn't bury them. They had to carry them to massive pits. Unfortunately, the people in the Middle Ages didn't know that the disease was carried by rats. This made larger cities and towns, which were very dirty during the Middle Ages, especially dangerous as there were lots of rats there. Sometimes entire towns or villages were wiped out by the plague. As you might expect, there was panic. Many people were sure it was the end of the world. People locked their doors and tried to hide in their houses. However, this did little good in cities where rats and therefore fleas were everywhere. They also burned down houses and even entire villages to try to stop the disease.
The Black Death, also known as the Great Plague, the Black Plague, or simply the Plague, was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia, and peaking in Europe from 1347 to 1351.
The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, is the most common variety of the disease. It's named after the buboes, swollen lymph nodes, which typically develop within a week after an infected flea bites you. Swollen lymph nodes may be situated in the groin, armpit, or neck, about the size of a chicken egg, and tender and warm to the touch. Other signs and symptoms may include sudden onset of fever and chills, headache, fatigue, and muscle aches. The pneumonic plague is the next thing that comes after the bubonic plague. The pneumonic plague affects the lungs. It's the least common variety of the plague, but the most dangerous, because it can be spread from person to person with cough droplets. Signs and symptoms can begin within a few hours after infection and may include cough with bloody sputum, difficulty breathing, nausea and vomiting, high fever, headache, and muscle weakness.
It is very hard to trace back, but it is believed that the Black Death, or bubonic plague, originated in the Gobi Desert way back in the 14th century. But prior to this, small outbreaks of the bubonic plague have been occurring in Asia. There are no exact figures for the death toll caused by the Black Plague, but the greater the population before the outbreak, the longer the duration of the period of abnormal mortality. It killed some 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia. The trend of recent research is pointing towards a figure more like 45 to 50%, so almost half of all of the population died from the Black Plague. Now imagine this. You working on your fields. You're working at home. You're sitting down for dinner. You're getting home from school, or even if they had school. And your buddy just dies. Just like that. He's dead. And then your mom. And then all that's left is you and your dad. Half the family. Say you show up to school and half of your class is gone after this dark age. Well, what do you call what caused it? The Black Plague. Here are some examples of what it would be like to die with the Black Plague. The majority of those who died, and the majority of the population, were serfs or peasants who did not have a clean home to go to or a safe area to avoid the plague. And when they died, the farms were empty. The fields only had half the people they had before, maybe even less, because of all the serfs being gone. And at that point, everything began to crumble. You see, serfs were the base of feudalism. Well, what's feudalism, you ask? Let me explain.
The feudal system. Under the feudal system, everyone but the king had a ruling lord above him to whom he owed loyalty and service in exchange for the land and protection. The king awarded land grants called fiefs to the nobles and sometimes to the church in return for the use of their soldiers or their influence on the citizens to protect the land. For safety and for defense, peasants in the Middle Ages formed small communities around a central lord or master. Most people lived on a manor, which consisted of the castle, church, village, and surrounding farmland. These manors were isolated with occasional visits from peddlers, pilgrims on their way to the Crusades, or soldiers from other fiefdoms.
Now you know about feudalism and how it's primarily political, while manorialism was more economic and social. Well, what's manorialism? Well, you're about to find out.
The Middle Ages system of manorialism was the organization of a rural economy and society. The Lord of Manor operated the system of manorialism, which gave him economic and legal power over his tenants. The Lord's land was called his domain, which he required to support himself and his retinue. The rest of manor land was allotted to the peasants, who were his tenants. The land was split up into a large number of small strips, usually about half an acre each. Peasants also had rights to use the common land and was allowed to take wood from the forest for fuel and building purposes. The peasants' holding, which also included a house in the village, thus forms a self-sufficient unit.